The quiet storm, the fluorescent lights of the Chicago Chess Club, cast harsh shadows across the tournament floor, where ambition and intellect collided in silent warfare. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her cream cardigan, her fingers trembling slightly. As she approached table 12, the scent of old leather and coffee mingled with the tension that crackled through the air like electricity before a storm. First tournament? Her opponent, Tom, smiled kindly as they shook hands. Yes, I'm probably in over my head. Sarah's voice barely rose above a whisper, but her dark eyes held depths that Tom couldn't quite read. Across the room, Richard Blackwell commanded attention like a predator surveying his territory. His silver hair caught the light as he adjusted his navy suit, every movement calculated to intimidate. At 58, he had crushed dreams for 3 decades, and today would be no different. Interesting field today, Richard murmured to the tournament director, his gaze sweeping past Sarah dismissively. Though I don't expect much resistance. Sarah's fingers found the worn chess piece in her pocket, a knight her grandfather had carved from driftwood before he died. The memory of his weathered hands guiding hers through midnight games filled her mind. Chess isn't about intimidation. Little sparrow, his voice echoed. It's about seeing what others cannot see. The first game began in silence. Tom played competently, but Sarah could see patterns emerging like constellations in a night sky. Each move her grandfather had taught her flowed through her fingers, decades of evening lessons crystallizing into pure instinct when she delivered. Checkmate in 23 moves, the room seemed to pause. Tom stared at the board, his face pale with disbelief. Where did you learn to play like that? From someone who believed in quiet strength, Sarah replied, her voice steady for the chomp. First time all day. Richard noticed the commotion and glanced over. The woman in the cardigan was collecting her pieces with the same methodical precision she'd used to dismantle her opponent. Something cold and predatory stirred in his chest. Interesting, he murmured, his smile sharp as a blade. Very interesting. Indeed. The predator's interest 3 rounds later, Sarah sat alone in the club's dimly lit cafe, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. Her hands still shook from adrenaline. 3 victories. 3 opponents who had underestimated the quiet librarian and paid the price on the board. Remarkable performance today. She looked up to find Richard Blackwell standing beside her table, his presence filling the space like smoke. Up close, his eyes were the color of winter storms, calculating and merciless. Thank you, Sarah managed, her voice catching. May. I? He gestured to the empty chair across from her. Before she could protest, he sat down, his movements fluid and predatory. The scent of expensive cologne mixed with something darker, something that made Sarah's pulse quicken with instinct. She couldn't name. Sarah Mitchell, isn't it? The librarian who appeared from nowhere. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Tell me, where did you really learn to play? My grandfather taught me. The lie came easier now, though her fingers found the carved knight in her pocket. Fascinating. Richard leaned back, studying her like she was a puzzle to be solved. Because that endgame in round 3, that was pure Capablanca. Not something most grandfathers would know. Sarah's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. I read chess books. Yes, I'm sure you do. His voice dropped lower, intimate and dangerous. But books don't teach you to see 7 moves ahead. Books don't give you the killer instinct I watched you display against Henderson in round 2. The air between them crackled with tension. Sarah felt exposed, like he was peeling back layers of her carefully constructed facade. What do you want? She whispered. Richard's smile turned genuine for the first time, and somehow that was more terrifying than his cold calculation. I want to know who you really are, Sarah Mitchell. Because tomorrow, in the semifinals, you're going to face me. He leaned forward, his voice barely audible. "And I have a feeling you're going to be the most interesting opponent I've faced in years." He stood to leave, pausing at her shoulder. "One more thing. That knight in your pocket? The one you keep touching when you're nervous? I'd love to hear the real story behind it." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She hadn't realized he'd been watching her so closely. Sweet dreams, little sparrow. The endearment hit her like a physical blow. No one had called her that since her grandfather died. As Richard walked away, Sarah realized with growing horror that tomorrow's game would be about much more than chess. The Devil's Gambit. The semifinal match drew a crowd that pressed against the velvet ropes like spectators at a gladiatorial arena. Sarah sat across from Richard, the board between them a battlefield where more than just pieces would be sacrificed. "Nervous?" Richard asked as he arranged his pieces with surgical precision. "Should I be?" Sarah's voice was steadier than she felt. "That depends on how much you value your secrets." A game began with classical opening moves, but Sarah could feel Richard probing, testing her responses like a doctor searching for a weakness. Each move carried weight beyond the board, psychological pressure designed to crack her facade. "Tell me about your grandfather," Richard said casually as he developed his knight. "The one who taught you chess." "He was a good man." Sarah's reply was clipped, focused on the emerging patterns. "Was he really?" Richard's queen slid into position, a predatory piece stalking across the board. "Because that defensive structure you're building, that's not something a loving grandfather teaches. That's something born from necessity, from survival." Sarah's hand hesitated over her bishop. "I don't know what you're talking about, don't you?" Richard leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "Because I think Sarah Mitchell, the librarian, is a beautiful lie. I think the woman sitting across from me learned chess in a place where losing meant more than just disappointment." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Her carefully constructed walls began to crack, memories bleeding through like water through broken stone. A different chess club, a different time. A man who called her his little sparrow while he taught her that chess was warfare, that mercy was weakness, that love was just another weapon to be wielded. "You're trying to distract me," she said, but her voice shook. "I'm trying to understand you." Richard captured her pawn, the piece falling, with a sound like breaking glass. "Because everything about you screams training, discipline, fear. And I should know. I recognize a fellow survivor when I see one." Sarah looked up sharply, meeting his winter storm eyes. For a moment, she saw past the predator's mask to something raw and wounded beneath. "What happened to you?" she whispered. Richard's smile turned savage. "The same thing that happened to you, I suspect. We learned that in chess, as in life, there are only predators and prey." He moved his queen into striking position. "The question is, which one are you really?" Sarah stared at the board, seeing not just the game, but the trap he'd laid with words as much as pieces. Her next move would reveal everything or destroy her completely. "Check," Richard said softly, though his queen wasn't threatening her king. It was then Sarah realized he wasn't talking about the game. The breaking point. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the position. Richard's psychological assault had worked perfectly, cracking her defenses and exposing the raw nerves beneath. But as she touched the carved knight in her pocket, a different memory surfaced. "The man who taught me chess," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent room, "wasn't my grandfather." Richard's eyes sharpened with predatory interest. "He was my chess coach, Viktor Petrov. He called me his little sparrow because he said I was fragile, easily broken." Sarah's fingers moved across the board with sudden certainty. He was wrong. She made her move, a queen sacrifice that left the watching crowd gasping. Richard stared at the board in genuine shock, as the true nature of her trap revealed itself. "Victor trained children like weapons," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "He broke us down and rebuilt us in his image. Cold, calculating, without mercy." She looked up at Richard, and he saw something terrible and familiar in her eyes. "He destroyed my childhood, my ability to trust, my capacity for normal relationships. But he made one mistake." "What mistake?" Richard's voice was barely a whisper. "He taught me to be better than him." The pieces fell like dominoes as Sarah's combination unfolded. Richard fought desperately, his own considerable skills no match for the trap she'd spent the entire game constructing. In 12 more moves, it would be checkmate. "You know, don't you?" Richard said suddenly. "About Milwaukee. About what I did to the Thompson boy." Sarah's hand froze over her piece. Milwaukee, the tournament where a promising young player had suffered a complete breakdown after facing Richard, never to play competitively again. "You destroyed him," she said. "I destroyed his illusions. Just like Victor destroyed yours." Richard's voice carried the weight of old wounds. "We are what we were made to be, Sarah. Monsters creating monsters." "No." Sarah's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "We can choose to be different." She made the move that would end the game, and stood and walked away from the board. The watching crowd erupted in confusion as she headed for the exit, leaving Richard alone with his inevitable defeat. "Where are you going?" Richard called. After her, his composed mask finally slipping. Sarah paused at the door, looking back with eyes that held both forgiveness and steel, to break the cycle. But as she stepped into the Chicago night, she didn't see Richard's smile return, colder and more calculating than ever. He had one more game to play, and this time the stakes would be everything Sarah held dear. Endgame, Sarah found Richard on the roof of the chess club at midnight, a portable board set up between 2 chairs overlooking the city lights. The wind carried the scent of rain and old secrets. "I wondered when you'd come," he said without looking up. "The police know about Milwaukee, about all of them." Sarah sat across from him, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. "I gave them the files." Richard's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Victor's files, the ones he kept on all his students. The ones that documented every psychological technique, every method of breaking young minds. He finally looked at her, and she saw the truth in his eyes. "You weren't the only one he trained, where you understand." The words hit her like ice water. "You were one of his students, his first success story, his masterpiece." Richard's hands moved pieces across the board in patterns that told a story of destruction and loss. 15 years old when he found me. Broken home, broken heart, perfect raw material for molding. Sarah felt the world shift beneath her feet. The tournaments, the destroyed careers. You were doing what he taught you. I was continuing his work, creating the next generation of psychological warriors. Richard's smile was hollow. "Until I met you. Until I realized Victor had created something he never intended." "What?" "Someone with the strength to choose differently." The rain began to fall, droplets scattered across the chessboard like tears. Sarah reached across the table and touched Richard's hand, feeling the tremor in his fingers that matched her own. "We don't have to be what he made us," she whispered. "Don't we?" Richard's voice broke. "I've destroyed so many promising players, Sarah. Crushed them because I couldn't bear to see them succeed where I had been broken. How do I live with that? By choosing to do better, by helping instead of hurting." Richard stared at their joined hands, seeing possibility where before there had been only darkness. "The files you gave the police, they'll destroy us both." "I know." Sarah's voice was calm, accepting. "But maybe that's what it takes to break the cycle. Maybe we have to sacrifice ourselves to save the others." They sat in silence as the rain intensified, washing the chess pieces clean. Two broken souls who had found each other too late, yet somehow at exactly the right moment. "If I could go back," Richard said finally, "if I could choose differently from the beginning, would you ... Yes, Sarah's answer came without hesitation. In any timeline, in any world where we weren't twisted by his poison. Yes. Richard lifted their joined hands and kissed her knuckles gently, a gesture that spoke of tenderness neither had known. They were still capable of. "Then maybe in the next game," he said, "we'll get to play for love instead of survival." The sirens grew louder in the distance, justice finally coming for them both. But as Sarah looked into Richard's eyes, she saw not the predator who had hunted her, but the boy who had been broken long before they met. And in that recognition, she found not redemption, but something rarer, the possibility of peace. The rain washed away the chess pieces one by one, leaving only empty squares and the promise that some cycles, once broken, could never be rebuilt. The end.